way, I think we're gonna call this meeting to order to get started because there's a lot of people here today. We apologize for the room, but at short notice is when you're trying to line up a room, you have to take what you can get, and this will work out fine if it doesn't seem to. There she is. Morning, Michelle. So, we have what we have, and it looks like it'll work out all right. So, it'll work. I've asked for approval of the agenda, and I would like to probably move number 2 down a little ways when possibly down just between number 4 and 5, if that's all right. Talking about the scope, we gotta get there, but we want to have some discussion as to where we're going with this, and we'd like to hear from the chief before that. Discussion. So would that be all right?
I move that we move item number 2 to follow, discuss scheduling interviews.
Second. Thank you. So with that, you had the chance to review the minutes, and I know we have a little adjusted copy in front of us. So, we've had a chance, or do you have any comments on that? On the minutes, it identifies city commissioners present as Deputy Chief Mahoney, I think it's Deputy Mayor. What's it did?
Thank you.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
With that change, I move to approve the minutes from the last meeting.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Here we'll move number 2. So, with that, we could, to get this started, we were, I know there's been some discussion by the city council to talk about a review of different situations in the Fargo Police Department, but then Chief Ternes did write a letter to the city council and asked for an independent study, and Fargo City Council formed one, and we're it. And we thought we'd like to hear from the chief and kind of talk about the letter that he wrote and why he wrote the letter, what he wants to see, what he's asking for, and things along that line. Just kind of give you an open mic on where you want to see this go, and follow the letter, and maybe ask some questions and help us determine where we're going with this.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Brian. Good morning to the committee members. I appreciate you taking the time out of, I'm sure, all of your busy schedules to help us work through some of the issues. But quite frankly, one of the reasons why I wrote the letter requesting that the City Commission engage in having some type of an internal review process within the department is actually for 2 primary reasons. The first is that as the police chief within our organization, I am very committed to making sure that our organization continues to serve the citizens of Fargo as effectively and efficiently as we can. And if there's even a suggestion that that is being compromised to whatever degree, then I think not only do I have a responsibility, but I have an obligation to make sure that whatever might be impeding that effectiveness and efficiency gets addressed. So I wanted to make sure that whether it was from either an external or an internal perspective, if there was anything that was leaving a perception, real or perceived, that those effectiveness and the efficiency of the department was being compromised, we needed to address that. And I think we needed to address it independently to ensure that whatever deficiencies might exist are being addressed adequately. But the second reason is that I think just like any other organization, big or small, private or government related, our organization is susceptible to any number of issues that might compromise individual employees' interest, desire, energy, whatever you wanna call it, when they come to the workplace. And I wanna make sure that if there are any things that can or should be improved, to assist employees in the overall scope of the performance of their job expectations, that we also have those addressed. And so, like I said, I think any police chief, any sheriff, any chief executive officer of a private organization, if they really are sincerely interested in making sure that the organization is running at full speed and accomplishing the goals and missions of that organization, that they make a commitment and not be the least bit fearful of having an independent examination done of their organization, and hence the reason and really the motivation behind my requesting that the City Commission initiate this undertaking. So I'm very happy, I'm very confident, very interested in having this group conduct that type of an examination with the overall goal of identifying what, if any, deficiencies exist, so that we can improve upon them and make whatever improvements we need to within the Fargo Police Department.
Sure. Well, thank you, Chief. And I guess that says a lot. That I'm assuming the next request that the committee would have is that we would hope we would have unfettered access to your department, and hopefully that the members could be assured of open communication with us to try to determine, if you've said you want to get at any realistic or perceived communication issue, and I notice you do use the word state of department's morale, and communication is a big part of that, and I'm sure the department does, every department does strive for that communication, but there are communications breakdowns at times, and open dialogue with your staff like this may be very, very helpful, just in them being able to air the open.
Yes.
So we really appreciate that. Well, I think you helped us identify what you want to see out of this process, and we appreciate that. Any questions from the committee members? And I'm sure there will be a time when we want to sit down and have a member of the committee probably will have questions for you directly, and we look forward to that.
Yes.
As this pushes forward. If there's no questions, we would like to move on to Lieutenant Mitchell, who was here today. That you were in charge of the standards.
That's correct. I was assigned to that position for 4 years, for the past 4 years. I came out of there in April of this year.
Well, I guess we'd like to have you discuss the office of the standards. What do you guys do? What do you take a look at? How do you gather your input in regards to writing your policies and procedures? How you handle a process that comes in, an internal investigation, or things along those lines? If you could, I don't want to say briefly describe it, we want you to take your time, but help us understand what the office does and how you help the chief's office and things.
I will give you a brief. I'll keep it as brief as I can. I know Chief Ternes distributed our policy pertaining to personnel complaints earlier this week, and I don't know if everyone had a chance to look at it. But like I said, my position in the last 4 years, I was assigned to the Office of Professional Standards, and my primary role was to field personnel complaints, or to field complaints from citizens, and then determine what direction that complaint should go. And by that I mean, if the merits of the case or the merits of the complaint warranted a personnel complaint, then one would be open. Many times when I get those initial phone calls, some of those concerns that a citizen may have could sometimes be resolved without going down the complaint process. Other times there was some merit to it, but it possibly didn't rise to the level of a personnel complaint, and I would open what was termed an inquiry, where I would just do a brief investigation, talk to the officer, kind of get their version. But when a complaint was opened, that's basically when my investigation really would get going. Once I received a complaint and I did open it, the officer was notified within 72 hours that the complaint was generated. From that point, I had 60 days to complete the investigation. Typically that was done depending on what type of an event it was, what type of complaint it was. I would say typically that was the process probably lasted a week or two. So it rarely, if ever, reached that 60-day mark. Once that process was done, I would submit those investigations and those reports to the chief, and he would either sustain or not sustain. We had several different classifications on how he can resolve a complaint. If it was sustained, then it would go to the officer's lieutenant, and he would make a disciplinary recommendation, and then that would come back up through the chain of command to the chief and for final resolution. I always viewed the office that I had as an education tool, more so than a punitive tool. The officers always, when they would come up and receive some type of policy review, recommendations oftentimes included some continued training and whatever the issue that they had. Most of our complaints were relatively minor in nature. And by that I mean, and this might not seem minor to those in attendance, but occasionally an officer would miss court, would miss an assignment, would have a relatively minor traffic crash. I mean, those were the typical types of complaints that I would initiate and investigate.
Okay. Lieutenant, when you say complaints, who would complain in regards to that? I guess I would think if an officer missed a court date or something like a traffic accident, the sergeant or the lieutenant then writes up a report and does some investigation, or does that immediately come to your office or something like that?
The complaints that would get initiated were oftentimes external, citizen complaint.
Right,
that's
what I would think.
A lot of times they were also internal, and by that I mean it could come from our dispatch center, it could come from our municipal court. Sometimes if there was a traffic crash, our process for that is if an officer involved in a crash, a sergeant is assigned to investigate it. That report then gets sent up the chain to our deputy chief in charge of field services, and if he deems that crash to be preventable and reportable, then he will initiate personnel complaints. He'll fill out the forms and then it comes to me.
Oh.
So we have an internal process as well for initiating complaints.
Okay. So most complaints within the department will come through your office at some time?
They all do.
Oh, okay.
If it's a formal complaint, they all came through my office.
I have a question for you. Is there a difference between formal and informal?
At one time, and I believe the policy still discusses informal complaints. Anything that comes through my office and I open the complaint process, it's a formal complaint, and it goes down that channel. The informal ones are more that when I open a kind of a cursory investigation and I don't, and it doesn't lead to a formal complaint. In other words, the officer never receives a complaint notification. It doesn't go through our typical process of up the chain and then a resolution. Those I guess I would term as to be informal.
And then informal complaints are still addressed though?
Yes.
Okay.
Everything that comes through my office and the sergeants, when they receive a phone call, they'll address it with the citizen. Anything that we get will be addressed, and if that means we have to talk to an officer informally without having any documentation, that process always takes place.
If I'm an employee within the department and I feel like I have either been skipped over for a promotion or something, or I have an issue, how would that work? Would I use this policy, or would it use another process?
There would be a separate process.
Okay. How would that be different than this policy?
You want to address that?
Yeah, if we were talking about an issue where an officer had a disagreement with promotion, assignment, those would follow one of two paths. More than likely, the first path would be that the officer could bring that issue or their concern to the attention of their immediate supervisor, all the way up through the chain of command to include having that discussion with me. If they were still dissatisfied with either the explanation that we would provide the employee, they could always bring that issue across the street where the Human Resources Office may deal with that, because anytime we have a promotion, where people are competing for a position where there is some economic advantage. It could be a promotion, it could be, it's very, very rare that there's an economic thing that occurs outside of promotion, but we have had, in the past, we have had lateral assignments or out of grade pay assignments, but those things as well, if they weren't dealt with to the employee satisfaction within the department, they could come over to the human resources office, and that's where those would be cured. I might, if you'll allow me, I might provide just a little bit further explanation regarding the question about formal versus informal complaints. I would guess that every day, somebody, most of the time it's a member of the community, but every day we receive a complaint from somebody who is dissatisfied about something the police department has done. Maybe the person's received a traffic ticket, maybe they were unhappy with the way a police officer responded to their call for service, maybe they were unhappy with the details that were outlined in a police report. But I would guess every day somebody calls the police department. In fact, I'm guessing it happens more than once, and they're dissatisfied with something. A great majority of those issues are dealt with in a very informal manner. In other words, the supervisor, could be the sergeant, could be the lieutenant, it could be the Office of Professional Standards that takes those type of calls. They are generally resolved by way of providing the citizen with some explanation, maybe a description of police procedure, why we do certain things the way that we do them. It doesn't necessarily mean that the person making the complaint leaves satisfied, but it doesn't necessarily mean that those issues evolve into a big formal personnel issue. And one of the primary responsibilities that Lieutenant Mitchell and now Sergeant Offelt, who is now in the Professional Standards Office, but one of the primary responsibilities of that person is to be somewhat of a filter, to try and determine and assess, does this issue that's being brought to our attention, can it be resolved by way of some informal discussion? Can it be resolved in a manner that is less than formal, or does it rise to the level, is it concerning to the point where it has to evolve into a formal complaint? And some of those things are fairly obvious. If we were to get a call from somebody who wanted to make a complaint that an officer had used excessive force, for example, just the mere allegation of a police officer using excessive force on another person would more than likely trigger that into a formal complaint almost immediately. But there are times where somebody brings to our attention that maybe an officer was rude or discourteous, or maybe they used profanity in their interaction with them. That more than likely would start out as an inquiry that the Professional Standards Office would examine. But during the course of that examination, if there becomes more to that story, maybe it was more than just one word of profanity. Maybe it was maybe that profanity took place on a playground over the noon hour at a school where 30 students were present. But that might be an extenuating factor where that might transition into a formal complaint. Or maybe the officer or the employee that's the subject of that complaint has a history of that type of behavior, where it's not necessarily an isolated incident. That might transition it into a formal complaint. So like I said, one of the primary tasks, and it at times can be a difficult task for the Office of Professional Standards, is to be that filter and try to determine what is the best mechanism for the issue that's being brought to our attention to be dealt with.
Oftentimes when those would come in, like the chief just described, the officer lieutenant would be involved in that process as well. And they'd be aware of what was going on with that inquiry or that investigation, albeit informal. And they a lot of times would tell me the direction that they wanted to see that go. In other words, they knew their work history far better than I did in the Office of Professional Standards. If it was a repeated problem or something they'd seen in the past, and it started off as a profanity use or something like that, they would advise me on the direction that they wanted to see that go. So there was always discussion with the supervision of that officer as well as the citizen that made the complaint.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. I'm glad you explained that, because that's, I guess, the question I did have is, with every inquiry or identified complaint, a official investigation and whatnot. But Jim has a question.
Just a couple of questions. One, Chief, perhaps you could talk a little bit about if an officer is found to be dishonest in any way and the impact that that has on them regarding their credibility as a witness.
There are, and this may not necessarily be the best way to articulate this, but it certainly seems to be appropriate. And where I'm going with that is, within our organization, and again, I don't necessarily think that this is some anomaly that's unique to the Fargo Police Department, but within our organization, we have what I describe as two cardinal sins. Two things that police officers simply cannot survive. And probably the most pressing of those two issues is honesty. And our policy is crystal clear on that issue, where our expectation is that as a sworn police officer within our department, that there is no substitute for honesty. They have to be honest when they conduct everything from putting things on paper relative to a police report, or if they happen to be the subject of a personnel matter, if the Office of Professional Standards or anybody else for that matter questions them about it, our expectation is that they are completely truthful about whatever the issue is. And like I said, our policy is crystal clear, where we even make the footnote that any substantiated act of dishonesty, that the presumed outcome for that is the termination of their employment, period. And I think, like I said, I think most police officers, most police administrators, most law enforcement agencies across the country probably have either that exact or pretty darn close to the exact same standard when we talk about honesty. The other cardinal sin, which at times can be a little bit more ambiguous, but in an organization like a police agency, which is somewhat, well, it's paramilitary, and that is insubordination. Police officers, we have to have a standard within law enforcement where if a police supervisor gives direction to another police officer, that direction has to be followed without question. And so when we talk about that insubordination issue, in fact, I tell all of the recruit officers from day one is that if a police sergeant, if a lieutenant, if a senior officer gives them a direction, they have to follow it unequivocally. And because of, as you might imagine, standing in the middle of the street having an argument or a debate over the merit of a supervisor's order is not the time to be having that debate. And it's not to say that employees can't come and question that order after the fact, but we expect them to follow orders. So those are the two cardinal sins that we have within our organization: dishonesty and insubordination. But to answer Jim's question, or to circle back to that, one of the cornerstones of our organization is accountability. And synonymous, I think, with accountability is making sure that our employees, especially the sworn officers, demonstrate a level of honesty that is second to none, and really it's a standard that I think most cops hold pretty dear. So honesty is huge.
Just a little follow-up to that if I can. And when Sheriff Laney came to the sheriff's office here, we brought this program, but timing-wise, I mean, the length of time that it takes from the initial complaint to completion in a case where it may be financially against the officer, where they're going to lose money in some way, shape, or form, salary, whether it's a suspension, demotion, or whatever. How long does it take from day one to completion, and is there any way to kind of speed that up?
Yeah, that's a continuing challenge for our organization and others, because by way of our policy, we give ourselves 60 days from start to finish to have those issued. I would dare say that a majority of the personnel matters that we deal with are usually resolved within that 60-day window, but depending upon the complexity of it, there are times where it certainly is going to extend beyond that 60 days. I would say, though, that is the rare exception. Of course, from my perspective, and I think Mike would agree with me, 60 days seems like it could be a fairly tight window to get something that's got any complexity to it whatsoever accomplished. But of course, if you're in the shoes of the officer, you want it resolved as quickly as possible. Sitting and waiting for the department's administration to get those things resolved, I'm certain can be a trying experience. So we only have the one individual. It's a sergeant's position that is assigned to the Office of Professional Standards. Fortunately, we don't deal with a lot of personnel matters. In fact, on an annual basis, if we go back over the course of the last 5 years, we're dealing with somewhere between 25 and 30 formal complaints that are dealt with on an annual basis. But like I said, every day, somebody brings something to our attention and we resolve it rather quickly.
Well, that's not doesn't seem like an astronomical number of 25 to 30 complaints for a department your size. Just to follow up on Jim's question in regards to the honesty of the officer and your explanation of that, and we know, we have to trust our police officers, we understand that. But how about from a court standpoint, what's the issue there?
Well, it's a huge issue because I think, there's a formal and an informal response to that as well. Informally, I think if you talk to just about any prosecuting attorney, judges, if a police officer has even the slightest reputation for dishonesty, you can about imagine how that may compromise their testimony in court. If from the time the officer sits in the witness chair, if the prosecuting attorney and the judge or a jury is even questioning the officer's integrity, that can have huge implications for the outcome. But there's also the formal application of this, and it falls under the umbrella of Brady disclosure. And I won't pretend to try and explain that entire process. I'm guessing some of you, if not most of you, are familiar with that. But under Brady, the prosecuting attorneys actually have an obligation to disclose past history from a police officer, if they're going to be a potential witness, if they have a past history of where their honesty or integrity is even questioned, prosecuting attorneys have a responsibility to disclose that to the defense attorney.